If the wildfires of the last 4 years have taught us anything, it's that we need to be prepared for everything. Now more than ever, strong communication and planning are necessary to keep businesses running, morale high, and panic to a minimum. Here to walk us through her research on the subject is Dr. Judith Ford, an interdisciplinary scholar, writer, and teacher with 20 years of broad multinational academic, commercial, and advocacy experience. Judith received her PhD from the University of Amsterdam and is currently a Sustainability and Resilience Fellow at Sonoma State University's Center for Environmental Inquiry. Thanks for joining us, Judith.
Thank you, Erin. Good morning. My name is Judith Ford, as Erin said, and I work with the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State on sustainability and resilience research and engagement. For the past 2.5 years, I have worked with a team of researchers at the Wine Business Institute on our campus, exploring disaster preparedness in the wine industry. As Winston Churchill once famously said, when negotiating the United Nations from the rubble of World War II, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I hope that this presentation provides you all with some ideas to leverage the many crises which have impacted the wine industry and beyond from the lessons of disasters past. Next slide, please. Now, the same climate and topography that make great wine is also vulnerable to a triad of natural disasters. And here's a list here, and I know that this list is not even complete. Next slide. Recent wildfire, flooding, and earthquakes, particularly over the past 4 years, vividly illustrate the need for the wine industry to be prepared. Next slide, please. In 2018, less than a year after wildfires swept through Napa and Sonoma counties, our research team surveyed thousands of wineries in the Western United States and interviewed winemakers, strategists, and operational executives, tasting room staff, and line workers of bonded wineries in the Stag's Leap AVA in Napa County and the Dry Creek AVA in Sonoma County to better understand their perceived preparedness for natural disaster. Next slide, please. We found that most had production level plans by OSHA for safety, but few had actually even thought about planning for natural disasters. Interestingly enough, the prospect of our interviews actually provoked some of them to even a base level improvement in their preparedness. Next slide. We noticed that the proximity to prior disaster, both in time and distance, had a notable influence on the importance that wineries put on preparedness for the next disaster. Next slide, please. Now, many of the hard lessons learned came from mismatches in insurance, a lack of cloud storage, backup power and baseline for smokiness in their fruit. The Napa Valley wineries, which were in the direct path of wildfire in 2018, were fortunate in that year because crush occurred earlier than in prior years, and most fruit was already stored. This year, they were not so lucky. The biggest issues in 2018 actually came more from power outages and the consequent shutdown of pump overs and temperature controls on tanks. We learned that some executives snuck behind evacuation lines in order to visually verify the conditions of the wineries, thereby endangering themselves and the resources of their first responders. And finally, we found that in the tribe-like community of wine regions, informal communication abounds. In the case of one family learning of the need to evacuate via connection 300 miles away, these channels actually saved lives. In other cases, these channels filled an information gap from the wineries themselves and spread the belief that the entire wine country of Sonoma and Napa County was on fire. And this had a rippling effect on tourism and tasting room sales throughout the region for months. Yet we were inspired by so many acts of compassion, like vintners who overrode competitive policies and bought, stored, sold, processed, and blended fruit for competitive wineries affected by natural disasters. Next slide, please. Now, we expected our research to uphold some commonly held ideas in management theory, and namely that is that the bigger and older your organization is, and the higher up that you sit in that organization, the greater you usually perceive your preparedness for disaster. Yet neither our surveys nor our interviews really reflected this. Next slide, please. What we did discover was that one of the single biggest indicators of preparedness was the level of organizational trust within each winery. Now, scholars have noted that organizations with high levels of cultural trust recruit and retain highly motivated employees who make their own decisions, take risk, innovate, and display organizational citizenship behavior. Next slide, please. And it turns out we actually know quite a bit about the relationship between ethical behavior of an organization's leaders to increasing employee commitment to the organization and building organizational trust. Organizations with high levels of trust empower employees to take calculated risks. Next slide, please. And it turns out that this empowerment, driven by high levels of organizational trust, makes the difference in whether an organization will survive and thrive in the face of crisis and change. When employees feel valued and empowered, they take risks, they make decisions, and they simply do the right thing in time of disaster, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Those without that critical trust will hesitate to act, not knowing whether they will be supported later by their managers. The indiscriminate, displacing nature of disaster means that employees in a position to help save people and property in an emergency may not be the same employees who in normal times actually have the authority to make decisions. Building organizational trust ensures employees know that they are empowered during emergencies, and asking questions of all layers of the organization can provide valuable insight. Next slide, please. As for the practical lessons we learned, when disaster strikes, mitigating long-term impact depended upon the quality and depth of 3 layers of communication. And when establishing communication protocols, organizations should remember the following. Disaster is both personal and professional. Disasters separate families, isolate management, and generally disrupt the normal decision-making process. Create a backup management structure and decision-making authority so that your business can respond, while individuals who have lost homes, loved ones, or been injured themselves can focus on personal losses. Assemble and store employee home, cell, and family contact details in multiple locations, ensuring that everyone knows how to access this information. Establish phone trees with multiple contingencies. In times of emergency, communicating with others locally is actually often easier via a remote, centralized place. Establish a manned call-in number to establish the safety and location of your employees that is based at least 200 miles away. Register for appropriate emergency alerts. Sonoma County uses SOCO, Mendocino County Mendo Alert, Napa County and many others rely on the Nixle system. Communicate constantly throughout the event to employees, press, family, and emergency services through multiple channels. It is nearly impossible to over-communicate, provided that your message is consistent. And to whatever extent possible, coordinate your communication with the larger wine region to prevent long-term reputational damage. In 2017, the wine region was flooded with cancellations by potential visitors who assumed the entire area was in flames. In 2020, more wineries were impacted by the fires, and they were spread across an even greater portion of the prime harvest tourist season. Now, when asked directly, a spokesperson for Visit Napa Valley will be very careful to note that only 6.5% of the county's 475 wineries were directly affected by the fire. I'm talking about the glass fire at this point, and only 11 of those suffered major damage or destruction. Yet, the industry advocacy websites of Visit Napa Valley Vintners, Sonoma County Wine Growers, Sonoma County Vintners, they don't provide a single mention of the fires. And while fires are likely to be on the top of mind for any potential tourist, it's as if by not mentioning the fires, they hope that no one will think about them. Next slide. Now, theoretical disasters are no one's favorite topic, but planning and rehearsing scenarios are actually empowering. Proximity to prior disaster in both distance and time influences people's interest in preparedness, so use the recent disasters as teaching moments now. Remember that the topography, climate, and conditions which destroyed other lives, homes, and wineries are ever present for yours too. As Robert Molnar of Obsidian Ridge Winery recently commented, we live in a fire ecosystem and we have planted vineyards in the middle of that fire ecosystem. Now, for most of the West Coast, fire season and the related power shutdowns and crush overlap. If you look at the fires of 2017 in October, 2018 December, 2019 October, and 2020 from August all the way to October, they're spread. So you need to run drills for all the various stages of crush and be sure to include any vineyard management company you employ in your disaster preparedness planning. Vineyard management employees are your employees too. You need to know and own their policies, because while the 2017 fires showed wineries leaving fruit on the vine during the wildfires, which generated sympathy, footage in 2020 showing vineyard workers picking in horrific air quality was bad optics, to say nothing of ethics. Even though disaster may not strike directly, everyone in the area will also likely lose power. Have a multi-day solar system battery pack or generator on site. Consider this an investment, an insurance policy against losing an entire year's vintage if pump overs and storage are compromised. Cut the power and make sure that everyone can get out. Invest in specific employee disaster training, first aid, EMT, wilderness survival, and emergency equipment, flashlights, masks, fire extinguishers, and hold drills so response becomes automatic. Equip employees with grab bags for sheltering in place and safety equipment for evacuation. Ensure the data is mirrored off-site and in the cloud. Assess insurance coverage to avoid the surprise faced by many Northern California wineries in 2017 when they learned that their policies reimbursed them for the agricultural value of their fruit, not the production value of their wine, and the differential in value is obvious. In the event of evacuation, insist on virtual, not physical, visual verification. It's very, very human to want to know, yet sneaking behind evacuation lines to check on winery operations threatens lives and emergency resources. Management should insist that no one ignores evacuation orders. CAL FIRE created the real-time structure status map for the campfire, which is attached to the link on my slide. They could do so for future fires. It allows you to really zero in and actually look in real time what's happening with your particular structure. Unfortunately, they didn't create these maps again for the glass fire, nor any of the fires that I could find for this year. So one might again sadly presume that there were executives again sneaking behind evacuation lines in order to check the status of their wineries. Communicate status reports to all stakeholders, which leads us to our last set of recommendations. Next slide, please. Wildfire, earthquakes, and floods are indiscriminate. As much as we would like to plan for all contingencies, we're only as resilient as our communities. Investing in preparedness beyond our gates creates a more resilient place for everyone. Work with surrounding neighbors, towns, residents, wineries, property owners, and local emergency services to create a resilience plan. Learn about fire breaks, map out historical fire paths, create a green belt around your community, make a shelter-in-place plan in the event of an earthquake when you're cut off from help, communication, and family, as well as an evacuation plan in the event of wildfire or flood. Find out who in your community has water, backup power, stored food, satellite phones, radios. And if you are lucky enough to be unaffected by a recent nearby disaster, understand what resources you have and you could make available to help others. In 2017, wineries crossed policy lines to buy, sell, process fruit, safely verify the safety of neighbors, etc., which helped the entire industry bounce back and project a stronger image to the outside world. And it's this strong image upon which every winery depends for visitation and sales. And finally, any strategy should include an assessment of long-term climatic changes, which are increasing temperatures, decreasing water supply, lengthening and intensifying the fire season and flooding. So sharing best practices also with other wineries not only increases resilience to these changes, but can help reverse the underlying causes of the changes as well. Now, we've put all of these recommendations into a short checklist, which I understand you all received yesterday. It's also linked into this slide and is available through the organizers. Next slide. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Judith. That was a lot of great information. I just want to remind all of our attendees that we will have copies of these presentations available with the recordings once we have those processed and ready. And we will make sure that you received a copy of the checklist. If you didn't, please shoot us an email and we'll send it over to you. Judith, thank you so much for joining us today. It sounds like communication is really the one thing that wineries could do to prepare with their employees, with their neighbors, with their families. That seemed like the running theme.
Most definitely. It was critical both in the ways that wineries responded positively and also maybe got themselves into a little bit of trouble. And as I think I said, you can almost not over communicate as long as you really, when you think about crisis communication, that's one of the golden rules, really is that your message is consistent, that you have consistent spokespeople, and that the more communication that's done in advance, so that people know where to get information. One of the things that we found was that families actually had no idea. They had no way of knowing things that happened during the day. Is my family member safe or not? And so just establishing all of those various ways that you're going to communicate with all of your stakeholders, all of your constituents, is really important. And the more that's done up front, the more structured and people will know what to expect.
Great. Well, if we have more questions come in throughout the day, I will be sure to send those over and get those answered. Thank you for joining us, Judith. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.